If Japan had never attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the entire trajectory of the Second World War, and perhaps of the 20th century itself, would have changed dramatically. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not only a military strike, it was a political detonator. It brought the United States fully into the war, united a divided population, and unleashed industrial and military power on a scale the world had never seen. Without that spark, both Axis and Allied strategies would have evolved in profoundly different ways. To understand this scenario, we must return to the late 1930s. Japan's imperial ambitions in Asia had already begun long before Pearl Harbor. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the full-scale war with China in 1937, and the occupation of French Indochina in 1940 had all demonstrated Tokyo's determination to dominate East Asia. But those ambitions had also provoked increasing hostility from the United States, which depended on access to Asian markets and resources. In response to Japan's expansion, Washington imposed economic sanctions and, in 1941, a total oil embargo. For Japan, a nation with almost no domestic oil supply, the embargo meant economic strangulation within months. This was the context in which Japan's leaders debated their next move. Either withdraw from China and accept diplomatic humiliation, or secure oil and resources by force from the colonies of European powers now weakened by the war in Europe. The choice led them towards Southeast Asia, and to the decision to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. In this alternate timeline, imagine that Japan's leadership, perhaps under stronger influence from moderate voices like Admiral Yamamoto or the Foreign Ministry, decides against the strike. Instead, Japan continues to push southward, invading British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, but avoids direct confrontation with the United States. Initially, this might have bought Japan time. The United States, without a direct attack on its forces, would have faced immense political resistance to declaring war. Public opinion in 1941 was still largely isolationist. President Franklin Roosevelt had moved cautiously toward supporting Britain through measures like Lend-Lease, but he faced strong opposition in Congress and from the public against entering another European conflict. Without Pearl Harbor, it is likely that America would have continued its policy of arsenal of democracy, supplying weapons and materials to the Allies without committing troops. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler's Germany would have been the main beneficiary. In December 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States only after Japan's attack. Without that event, there would have been no formal reason for Germany to do so. The United States might have remained neutral in Europe for months, perhaps years longer. Britain would have continued to fight largely alone, supported by American supplies but without the direct military partnership that later made victory possible. The Soviet Union, bearing the full weight of the German invasion since June 1941, would have remained the key factor determining the war's outcome on the European front. By early 1942, Japan would likely have succeeded in capturing vital territories in Southeast Asia, Borneo, the Dutch East Indies, and perhaps Burma, securing the oil fields that were the primary goal of its southern strategy. Without the U.S. Pacific Fleet crippled, however, the balance of naval power would still favor the Americans in the long term. Yet without war, the United States would have had no political justification to deploy it. Instead, the Pacific would have entered a tense but fragile peace, marked by escalating naval patrols, trade restrictions, and occasional incidents that stopped short of open conflict. Diplomatically, Tokyo might have sought to consolidate its new empire under the banner of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, attempting to present its expansion as liberation from Western colonialism. Some governments under Axis influence, Thailand, Manchukuo, and Vichy-controlled territories, might have accepted this narrative. Others, particularly in the Philippines and British territories, would have seen it as simple imperialism. Still, without Pearl Harbor, Japan could have framed its actions as a regional matter rather than a global war. The critical question, however, would remain: how long could such a delicate balance last? The economic and ideological tensions between Washington and Tokyo were too deep to disappear. Even without the sudden shock of Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy and Japan's imperial forces would almost certainly have clashed sooner or later, perhaps over access to the Philippines or in response to Japanese attacks on British or Dutch colonies. But the timing would have changed everything. A delayed war might have meant that the United States entered the conflict in 1942 or 1943, better armed, with more aircraft carriers and modernized forces, and with greater public consensus. For the Soviet Union, this delay would have been decisive. In the real timeline, Japan refrained from attacking the USSR in the east, honoring its neutrality pact while Germany advanced from the west. That decision allowed Stalin to transfer over 1 million troops from Siberia to defend Moscow in late 1941. If Japan had not been at war with the United States, however, it might have reconsidered its stance. The Japanese army, eager to redeem its earlier defeat against the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, could have pressed for an attack on Siberia, especially if Germany seemed close to victory. The outcome of the Eastern Front might then have been catastrophic for the USSR. A two-front war against both Germany and Japan could have shattered Soviet defenses before American intervention was even politically possible. By 1943, with the Soviet Union possibly collapsing and Britain exhausted, Germany could have consolidated control over Europe and much of Western Russia. Japan, meanwhile, would have dominated Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim. The world might have become divided into vast spheres of Axis influence, a Eurasian bloc under Berlin and Tokyo, and an isolated, heavily fortified American hemisphere. The U.S. would have remained the only major industrial power untouched by war, yet hemmed in by Axis control of global trade routes. Such a standoff could have resembled a version of the Cold War, but one fought between the Axis powers and the United States decades earlier and under far darker ideological conditions. In this alternate world, America would have faced a strategic dilemma unlike any in its history. Its industrial potential was enormous, its economy recovering from the Great Depression, and its military buildup accelerating. But without the unifying shock of Pearl Harbor, the political will to use that power would have remained uncertain. Isolationism had deep roots in American society. Organizations such as the America First Committee, supported by figures like Charles Lindbergh, argued passionately against involvement in foreign wars. Even as reports of Nazi atrocities and Japanese aggression reached American newspapers, many citizens believed the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were sufficient protection. Roosevelt's administration, while increasingly convinced that the Axis had to be stopped, would have been constrained by the lack of a direct attack. The consequences for the Pacific theater would have been profound. Without a declaration of war, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would not have launched its island-hopping campaign, nor the decisive carrier battles such as Midway and the Coral Sea. Japan's dominance in the Western Pacific could have lasted for years. Its empire would have extended from northern China to the Dutch East Indies, encompassing hundreds of millions of people and vital natural resources. Economically, Japan could have achieved near self-sufficiency. Oil from Indonesia, rubber and tin from Malaya, rice from Indochina. This material base might have allowed Tokyo to sustain its occupation of China and its war of attrition against the Chinese nationalists indefinitely. However, this would not have guaranteed long-term stability. The Japanese economy was highly dependent on maritime transport, and its industrial base was limited compared to that of the United States. Maintaining such a vast empire would have required constant military deployment and suppression of resistance movements. Over time, guerrilla warfare in China, Burma, and the Philippines might have eroded Japan's control. The British Empire, though weakened, would have continued to fight through its colonies and the Royal Navy. If the United States remained formally neutral but increasingly hostile, covert cooperation between American and British intelligence, similar to the real-world ABCD line of powers opposing Japan, would have intensified. The Pacific might have become a tense, militarized standoff rather than a battlefield. In Europe, the absence of American intervention would have reshaped every major campaign. The invasion of North Africa in 1942, the Allied bombing of Germany, the landings in Italy and Normandy, none of these would have occurred. Britain, isolated but defiant, might have survived through its air defenses and naval strength, yet unable to liberate the continent. The Soviet Union, deprived of American supplies under Lend-Lease, would have struggled to replace lost tanks, trucks, and aircraft. Even if the USSR avoided total collapse, its advance westward would have been slowed or halted. The war in Europe might have ended not in Allied victory, but in a negotiated peace, a divided continent between Nazi and Soviet zones of control. For the Axis, this equilibrium could not have lasted forever. Japan and Germany, though allies, had divergent strategic goals and deep mutual suspicion. Their coordination during the actual war was minimal. Over time, as their empires expanded, friction over spheres of influence in India, Central Asia, or the Pacific might have emerged. If Germany dominated the Eurasian landmass and Japan the Pacific Rim, both would have viewed each other less as partners and more as rivals for global dominance. The ideological contradiction between Nazi racial hierarchy and Japan's vision of Asian unity under imperial rule would have ensured that peace between them was temporary. By the mid-1940s, with much of the world under Axis control, the United States would have faced growing pressure to rearm and assert itself. American naval expansion, already underway since 1940, would have produced a fleet of unprecedented scale. Carrier groups, submarines, and long-range bombers would have transformed the Pacific balance of power. Without Pearl Harbor, this buildup would have occurred methodically, without early wartime losses. By 1944 or 1945, the United States could have possessed overwhelming military superiority. Yet entering the war would still have required a political trigger. Perhaps an incident in the South China Sea or an attack on the Philippines would finally have provided it. When war eventually came, it would have been fought under entirely different conditions, with a fully mobilized America striking an overextended Japan. Nuclear weapons add another dimension to this scenario. The Manhattan Project was born from fears of a German atomic bomb, but it was accelerated only after the United States entered the war. Without Pearl Harbor, funding and urgency would have been far lower. It is conceivable that the atomic bomb would not have been ready by the mid-1940s. Germany's own nuclear research, though disorganized, might have advanced further in a longer war. If either Axis power had reached atomic capability first, the balance of power would have shifted catastrophically. The threat of nuclear coercion by Germany or Japan could have forced the United States into diplomatic concessions rather than open war. Culturally and politically, the absence of Pearl Harbor would have delayed the transformation of the United States into a global superpower. The real war ended the Great Depression, unified the nation, and established the military-industrial complex that defined the post-war era. Without it, the United States might have remained powerful but inward-looking, a continental giant hesitant to engage abroad. The post-war institutions that shaped the modern world, the United Nations, NATO, the Bretton Woods system, might never have been created. Instead, the global order could have evolved into competing authoritarian empires, with democratic governance surviving only in isolated regions. As for Japan, the avoidance of Pearl Harbor would not have guaranteed survival in the long term. Its aggressive expansion would eventually have provoked confrontation with one or more great powers. Internal dissent, resource shortages, and nationalist overreach could have led to collapse from within, much as occurred historically by 1945. But without American occupation, Japan's political evolution would have taken a very different course. It might have remained a militarized monarchy, continuing its imperial rule over Asia into the late 20th century. The human cost, in China, Southeast Asia, and beyond, would have been staggering. From a global perspective, the absence of the Pearl Harbor attack would have delayed but not prevented the eventual clash between democratic and authoritarian systems. The defining difference would have been timing and outcome. Instead of a clear Allied victory in 1945, the world might have slid into a long, multipolar conflict, part ideological, part economic, fought through proxies, revolutions, and technology races. The Cold War as we know it could have begun not between the United States and the Soviet Union, but between the United States, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan. Ultimately, Pearl Harbor's destruction forced the United States to confront a global reality it could no longer ignore. Without it, the world might have entered an age of extended tyranny before freedom reasserted itself. History is shaped not only by victories and defeats, but by moments that awaken nations. The absence of one morning's shock in Hawaii could have postponed that awakening and changed the fate of millions.